So Boxing Scene, ESPN, a lot of the big publications have reported that according to sources, Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. is done and it's been signed and it's going to take place in London on April 26th. So, I mean, we were just wondering like, okay, who is Conor Benn going to fight now that he's got his legal, PED issues with the British Board of Boxing, in the UK. He's gotten those cleared up, so now he can fight in the UK. His last couple of fights since that PED suspension, non-suspension, just that kind of PED purgatory. Conor Benn's last couple fights were in the US, and now he's finally cleared to fight in the UK. So here we go. I mean, some wanted to see him actually kind of play something out in the welterweight division, his actual division, because this fight is supposedly taking place at 160. Remember the first time they were scheduled to fight before he tested positive, Ben tested positive for PEDs. This was supposed to take place in late 2022 because Ben's last fight at that time was a knockout over Chris Van Heerden in April 2022. It was the fight before that where he knocked Chris Algieri out in December of 2021. But when they had first scheduled Ben versus Eubank Jr., it was supposed to take place at 157, a catch weight. So there was a concern like Chris Eubank, he's fight at 168, but mostly fights at 160. So he was going to have to lose 3 additional pounds to fight Conor Benn. Now they're at least doing 160 proper. Like Chris Eubank's last 3 fights at least have been at 160. Liam Smith, the back-to-back fights where Eubank got knocked out the first time, he stopped Liam Smith in the rematch, and then most recently against Kamil Zermeta. Those were all at 160, but there is a rehydration clause in Ben versus Eubank. It's supposedly 170. So I do like that this fight is actually going to be a true middleweight fight. It's like, okay, Conor Benn, if you want to come up and fight Chris Eubank Jr., don't put him at a physical health-based disadvantage by making him drop 3 pounds more than he drops in any of his other fights. That just doesn't seem to be an equitable arrangement for these guys to get in the ring. Like, I mean, they're not supposed to be fighting each other to begin with. That's why you have weight classes. But if the boxing public and if the promoters and if the fighters, because of their dad's legacy in the ring against one another, Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr., if this fight has to happen, then at least make it happen in a legit way. And I think that having this at 160 is more fair, even if it makes it a tougher mountain to climb for the smaller fighter, Conor Benn. It just is what it is. I mean, these guys are the sizes that they are. I just don't like it when you try to compromise one person's health by making them do something that's just kind of dietarily outrageous to be able to make that weight limit. And, shout out to my boy Ronaldo in our private chat. He did mention that, hey, Chris Eubank's got enough time since this fight's taking place in April. He's got enough time to hire the right nutritionist to be able to get his weight down in a way where the rehydration clause, the 170 10-pound rehydration clause, doesn't hurt him at the end of the day. He can do this in the right way if he's disciplined and if he prepares for it the right way. Remember when they were first scheduled to fight, it was Chris Eubank Jr. who was doing the trolling, showing himself out at the restaurant, eating a bunch of like big dinners and stuff. That was kind of funny. But yeah, this fight appears to be taking place. And, Conor Benn, it's interesting because these guys are at very different stages of their career. Chris Eubank Jr. has had a weird career. Like, he's never actually held the title. As talented as he is, he's never held an actual major belt. And he did fight some good fighters early in his career. His 2 early losses, or relatively early losses, were decisions to Billy Joe Saunders, I think that was at 154, and then to George Groves at 168 in that World Boxing Super Series. And to Chris Eubank Jr.'s credit, he did retire James DeGale, the pretty long time 168, an IBF champion, one of the best 168 pounders of his era. Chris Eubank Jr. beat him, and that still might be Chris Eubank Jr.'s best win, I think, to date. I mean, and around that time, I was thinking, damn, okay, now he's coming back down to 160, which he did. And I was just thinking, okay, the stage is set perfectly. Now he's going to be able to fight the other middleweights that matter in this era. But that just didn't happen. Like, he signed with PBC for a little while. He fought like Matt Korobov, who suffered an injury in the second round of their fight. Matt Korobov did. But after that, he fought like Marcus Morrison, Wanik Aldejan. And then he had an impressive showing against Liam Williams. But like, this was supposed to be the time where we were wanting to see him, fight against a Demetrius Andrade or Jamal Charlo, one of those types of fights to really show where you are in the division and maybe even pick up an actual belt. But I mean, the middleweight division has just been so frustrating over the past few years. Yes, we do now have Carlos Adames versus Hamza Shiraz scheduled. That's going to be a lot of fun to watch. But I feel like we've had a few like Hall of Fame talents that just don't end up having a Hall of Fame resume because they didn't fight the opponents that mattered most when it mattered most, right? Jamal Charlo, Demetrius Andrade, Chris Eubank Jr., and there are a couple of others. So Chris Eubank Jr. has just had this weird career where he looks sometimes like an elite talent, but he just isn't picking up the wins that'll prove it and that'll establish him as a near Hall of Fame worthy fighter. He's not even near the Hall of Fame given his track record, but he's a very talented guy, but he's also now 35 years old. So I mean, the way I see it, if you haven't been serious about your opponent selection since that George Groves loss, right? The loss to George Groves. If you haven't been serious about your opponent selection since that, and you're now 35 years old, I don't think you're going to get serious about it now. Like, it's clear he wants just the big money fight or two, and he's probably going to call it a career. So he's at that stage of his career. Whereas Conor Benn, I mean, he was on the upswing. He was building his name, beating Samuel Vargas, knocking him out in the first round, beating Samuel Vargas more scarily than Virgil Ortiz did, than I think Errol Spence did. Conor Benn destroyed Samuel Vargas in the first round. He beat Koivola and Sebastian Formella before that. After that, he beat Adrian Granados, who gave a lot of people tough fights. He gave Sean Porter, Adrian Broner tough fights. And then Conor Benn knocked out Chris Algieri, scary knockout in the fourth round. Then he knocked out Chris Van Heerden in the second round. Chris Van Heerden fought a longer fight against Errol Spence again. Then he lasted against Conor Benn. So Conor Benn was looking really, really dangerous, and he was starting to kind of up his opponent quality. And I was really wanting to see how he would do against, I mean, maybe not a Boots Ennis, because it didn't seem like Eddie Hearn would put him in the ring with anybody that scary. They were kind of building him up gradually. So I didn't expect to see Conor Benn in the ring with Boots or Virgil Ortiz, but I was thinking maybe a Stanionis, maybe some other like ranked number like 5 through 12, 15 welterweight, something like that. But then out of nowhere, they planned this Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. fight, and I'm like, what? That's where they're going with his career next? So fast forward, PED scandal, the fight's off. He's taken a couple lower level fights at 154 where he didn't look that good to me at 154, to be honest with you. And now they're actually going to reschedule, or they have reportedly rescheduled Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. So that's where we are. And, win or lose against Chris Eubank Jr., I hope that Conor Benn gets back on track and picks up from where he left off when he was beating the likes of Chris Algieri, when he was building himself at 147. I hope he goes back there after fighting Chris Eubank Jr. at 160. We'll see. This is going to be a pretty big payday, and you get varying responses to fighters who earn huge paydays on whether they start taking their career as seriously after that, right? So win or lose, I hope Conor Benn kind of flips the clock to 2022 and starts fighting the opponents that matter at 147. Like, there was a part of me that would have rather him fight Mario Barrios. Now, Barrios isn't a world beater, but he's a belt holder at 147, legit. And he just had that fight of the year contender against Abel Ramos that resulted in the draw. And if Conor Benn is really that guy, because I've got a lot of questions. Like, again, he didn't look that good at 154. Granted, it's a division up, but against Rodolfo Orozco and Peter Dobson, Conor Benn didn't look like the same guy that he was against Chris Van Heerden, Samuel Vargas, and Chris Algieri. He didn't look like he was as explosive, as dangerous. Maybe that was just because it was the division up. Maybe he was working off some ring rust, or maybe the PEDs that he got busted for contributed to his destructive nature at 147. So I was curious to see how he would do against Barrios. I would have favored him, I think, against Barrios. Like, Conor Benn was really starting to put together some skills. I was looking at his foot feints against Algieri, and he was developing into a really promising welterweight. But now I don't know what to make of him versus Chris Eubank Jr. My gut instinct tells me that unless Chris Eubank Jr. is weight drained, and yes, we did see him get stopped against Liam Smith, so some people will still question Chris Eubank's chin. But again, Conor Benn didn't look like a world beater against lower level 154 guys. So what's he really going to be bringing to the table at 160 against Chris Eubank Jr.? Look, I think Chris Eubank Jr. is a quicker fighter. He's kind of got some of that Roy Jones snappiness, right? Where he just kind of like feints, then he throws like a super quick uppercut or something like that. Or he could kind of like pot shot you from the outside. Conor Benn, I think is going to have his hands full. I think he's going to be blinded by some of the speed. I think he's going to be taking harder punches than he's probably ever taken before. Like, who has Conor Benn fought that really packs a punch and who actually hit him? Nobody, as far as I've seen, right? So he's gonna get hit harder than he's ever been hit before against Eubank. And again, I just don't think that he's gonna be bringing the artillery, the firepower at 160 against Eubank. Again, unless Eubank's weight drained, I can see Eubank just eating his lunch, and it's really up to Eubank how much he wants to put his foot on the gas, whether he can stop Conor Benn or whether he cruises more or less to a decision. Those are just my gut feelings on Conor Benn versus Chris Eubank Jr. But yeah, it looks like this fight is taking place in April. Let me know your thoughts on this fight. Are you happy that it got rescheduled, or would you have rather seen these guys fight relevant opponents in their respective divisions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.